From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
It is my sincere honor to introduce Amanda Ripley. This is the first time the book festival has had a formal science pavilion. And I think it's completely fitting that the first book we're discussing here is devoted to education and to competing visions of how children learn. Amanda's book, The Smartest Kids in the World and How They Got That Way, takes us to Finland, South Korea, and Poland, and observes how three high-scoring, highly successful educational systems work. And what's unique about it is she does it through the eyes of three American kids who are spending a year at each of those school systems. So it makes for a sort of a unique combination of her analysis and the insights that the high school kids provide. Reviewing the book in the Washington Post, Jay Matthews wrote that this was the most illuminating reporting I've ever seen on the differences between schools in America and abroad. And the New York Times said that in the best tradition of travel writing, Amanda Ripley gets well beneath the glossy surface of foreign cultures and manages to make our culture look strangely new. And as the dad of a first grader who just started at a new school, trust me, the conclusions have insights for kids of all ages and for the parents. Amanda is an investigative journalist with The Atlantic and Time and an Emerson Fellow at the New America Foundation. She's also the author previously of The Unthinkable, Who Survives When Disaster Strikes and Why. She'll be signing books at 11 o'clock today. Please join me in welcoming Amanda Ripley.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here on many levels, one of which is this is the city where I live. How many people live in Washington, D.C.? I assume almost all of you, or in the area. And the other reason is that I wrote much of my first book, or at least any of the parts that were decent, in the Library of Congress. It was the only place where I could find some focus and peace. I had a new baby at the time. This was my first book, The Unthinkable, and I would go there to this beautiful space, and there's part of it where you can't get on the internet, which is a wonderful luxury. And it was really a salvation. And to have such a beautiful place that we can all access is a privilege. So I'm very glad to be here for all those reasons. Very psyched that I got put into the science pavilion. You never know where you're going to end up when people categorize your book. What I want to do today is talk a little bit about a mystery. And it's a mystery that starts with data and has implications for the lives of millions of kids around the world. But what I also want to do is to hear questions and thoughts from all of you. So we're going to make sure to save some time for that at the end and turn this into more of a conversation if we can. It is, after all, Saturday morning, and you've come out here, and you deserve to have more of a conversation rather than just be spoken to. The mystery that I mentioned is a mystery that I think we've all sort of heard about. It's kind of in the ether. And as a reporter, I kept hearing about it as well. And the mystery was this. It appeared that there were a handful of countries that were now managing to educate virtually all their kids to high levels of critical thinking in math, reading, and science. And I would hear various theories about why that was so, right? We've all heard these theories. And I would buy into one or the other of them for a while. And then I would encounter some inexplicable barrier to that theory being true. So let me give you an example. One of the reasons that I heard for why these other countries were doing so great was that we don't spend enough on education, right? And in fact, we spend more per pupil on K through 12 education than all but 4 countries in the world. And interestingly, if you look at those 4 countries, they don't line up with the top performing education systems in the world. So it became clear that it's not that we weren't spending enough, it's that we weren't spending it the same way, maybe. We weren't spending it wisely, maybe, which made sense. Other reasons I heard were that we were too big and too diverse of a country to compare to a place like Finland, which is totally fair. I mean, really, Finland, this is a huge country we live in. And in some ways, I start to think about our country as 50 different countries, particularly when it comes to education, because so much of education is locally controlled. and is very different, when you go from Texas to Vermont to California. So that satisfied me for a while. But then, one day I tried looking at the data on a state-by-state basis and seeing how our kids were doing compared to other countries, imagining that all of our states were countries. And when you do that, you see not only huge variation from state to state, but you see that not even some of our smallest, most homogeneous states, like Maine, which is 94% white and has a quarter of the population of Finland, those kids were performing at about the level of kids in Portugal, which was about, below average or right around average for the developed world. So we weren't seeing the kinds of high flyers that you would expect. The two exceptions were Massachusetts and Minnesota. Do we have anyone from Massachusetts or Minnesota? There we go. So we have two states that really were, maybe not in the top 10, but certainly the top 15 to 20 countries in the world. So that was encouraging. But then, the most convincing theory I heard for why we weren't doing so great overall, or in some of these smaller states even, was poverty. And that made a lot of sense to me. I mean, we know that all over the world, poverty influences education outcomes. And we know that we have a really unacceptably high child poverty rate, given our wealth as a country. Right around 20%, depending on how you're measuring it, right? So that made a lot of sense to me. But then I started looking deeper into the data. And now we are, for better or for worse, awash in data right now, right, in education. We have more data than we know what to do with. It's sort of like healthcare this way. And if you look at it more deeply, what you see is that, well, look, there are actually countries that have very low child poverty rates. Like Norway has a 6% child poverty rate, which is close to that of Finland at 4%. Very low as it gets, really. All over the world. And what you see is that Norway's 15-year-olds are performing at about the same level as American 15-year-olds, which is to say, average for the developed world in reading and science, and below average in math. As you'll see, math is a recurring weakness for the US. And then, if you look within our data set for the US, you see something really astonishing, which is that if you look at our top quartile, top 25% of most affluent 15-year-olds, so these are kids who have lots of advantages, highly educated parents, high-tech schools, all kinds of resources. And by the way, this data set includes private schools. And if you look at those kids, you see that they are scoring below their affluent peers in 27 other countries in math. They do better in reading, although still not at the very top of the world. And if you look at our lowest quartile of kids, socioeconomically speaking, and compare them to underprivileged kids around the world, they too are scoring below 27 other countries in math. So there seem to be some systemic problems that interacted, for sure, with poverty, that interact with diversity, that interact with our history of institutionalized racism, that interact with many of these things. But it wasn't just one of those things, and no single one could fully explain what we were seeing. So I stopped everything else I was doing, writing-wise, and decided to spend a year trying to understand what was really going on in these countries. And I admit I did part of this sort of cynically. I just didn't believe it, actually. Like, I kept hearing about these brilliant kids in Finland and Singapore and Korea, and everyone was perfect, and there were no tests, and everything was awesome all the time, and the teachers were geniuses, and the parents were involved, and it just didn't pass the smell test to me. Like, it just didn't seem like any country is that simple. So I wanted to visit these countries, obviously, but I knew that to have any remote chance of seeing what was really going on, I needed to try to see it through the eyes of students. I'd learned in my reporting in the US that until you talk to students, you really don't know the half of it. And students are experts in their particular classroom. They sit there all day long thinking about what could be better and what they like and what they don't, and they have strong opinions if you ask them. So luckily, there are tens of thousands of teenagers who every year essentially trade places. They leave the United States and go attend public high schools abroad and live with a host family, or vice versa, for a year. So I wanted to follow these kids in particular because they could, to some small degree, see the water they swam in, right? They could have they didn't know everything, none of us do, but they knew their schools and their homes and their neighborhoods back in the States and abroad. And they were essentially amateur anthropologists. I mean, part of the reason kids go abroad is because they're interested in the differences between cultures and places. And they actually have very strong opinions, again, about what they see, what they like, what they don't like, what's surprising, what's not surprising. So in addition to all this data, which is totally fascinating, and I'm happy to geek out on that more in the Q&A afterward if you'd like, I had to have these kids to try to see in the blind spots that the data couldn't answer, that the data didn't get into. So I knew from the data which places I wanted to visit. There are lots of international tests these days. One thing we don't have, especially in the US, is a shortage of tests. That is not a problem we have. But there is a test that I found to be most useful when thinking about the future of the economy, which was called the Pisa Test, which is a test administered to 500,000 15-year-olds in 70 countries every 3 years by the OECD. And this test is not perfect, none of them are, but what I liked about this test is that it tried to get at not your ability to regurgitate information, but your ability to apply information to solve a problem you've never seen before that comes right out of real life. It's the kind of thing that we all have to do every day, not just in our jobs, but if we're picking a healthcare plan, or we're trying to figure out a credit card bill. All the kinds of things we have to do, given that we have an excess of information and a dearth of real insight sometimes. So we have to make judgments, we have to solve problems, we have to make arguments, all those kinds of higher order skills, which is what the Pisa test tries explicitly to do. So this test is interesting, and this is the test I'll be referring to. I looked at other test data as well as, and you also obviously want to look at metrics like high school graduation, college attainment, other things. But this test I found to be compelling because we don't actually know what jobs will be available in 20 or 30 years. But we do know that those skills, those abilities to solve problems, to make judgments, to make arguments, will be valuable. So I took the Pisa test, among other things, to see what that was all about, because it seemed, again, the cynic in me didn't believe it was possible to assess critical thinking. And I still think it's hard. But I did find the test to be far smarter than any standardized test I'd ever taken, for whatever that's worth. I routinely realized there was no right answer, and I had to write out my answer and try to make the case, and I would get different points depending on how cogent and compelling and precise my argument was, which is a lot like my actual life, right, in my actual work. So I was impressed with this test, realizing it's not perfect. And if you look at the outcomes on those tests, what you see is something, first of all, something awesome. And if there's nothing else that you take from international education comparisons, this is the one thing. Are you ready? The one thing is that all over the world, you see incredible amounts of change. We have not seen that at scale, but we are actually the outlier. So there's been 60-some countries that have taken this Pisa test since it was introduced in 2000. 40 of them have seen significant improvement in at least one subject. Just because we are not one of them does not mean we could not be, right? When you see the dramatic gains that some countries have made fairly recently, it gives you, or it should give all of us, a surge of hope. Because once you know it is possible for countries like Estonia, Canada, Vietnam, Poland, countries that have significant poverty rates, to make those kinds of gains, then not only should that be encouraging, and we would want to learn, of course, from what those countries did, but there's a sort of moral imperative, right, at that point. Once you know it's possible, it can be done, it's not merely an act of faith, then you must do it, right? So that, to me, is the number one reason to look at this international data. Another thing you notice when you look at it closely is that poverty matters in all of these countries, of course, but it matters to different degrees. So if you look at a country like the United States, you see that 15% of our kids' PISA scores can be explained by socioeconomic status. This is a little bit of math magic, right? So we're trying to control for everything and see how much is influenced by what, and imperfect, but 15%. If you look at a place like Estonia, which, has anyone been to Estonia? Okay, surprising number of people have been to Estonia. This is not, Finland. This is still a fairly complicated place. And in Estonia, socioeconomic status explains 9% of teenagers' scores on the Pisa test. So you see variance in different countries. By the way, France is worse than the US on this. So, for what it's worth, there are countries that do worse, not only on average, there are plenty of countries that do worse on average scores, but in equity, in fairness, and how much socioeconomic status matters. So, when you look at the really high-flying countries, the sort of education superpowers, what you see is that they could be roughly divided into two categories, very roughly. This is, I sort of made this up for my own brain to think about this. One category is the utopia category, of which the best and most cliched example is Finland. Finland is a country where there truly are very few standardized tests, where teachers do have a lot of autonomy, where students do not work night and day, and in fact, very few of them attend after-school tutoring and that sort of thing. And there's almost no variation from one school to the next in Finland. Imagine if you could just live wherever you wanted, without regard for the schools, because they were all basically just as good as the next. So that's incredibly cool about Finland, and that's the utopia version. It turns out there are multiple ways to get to the top of the mountain in education, right? Just like an actual mountain. You can do switchbacks and take breaks and drink water, which is Finland. Or you can just slog right up the mountain like a vertical line, which is South Korea. So the other model would be the pressure cooker model, where kids are getting to the same place, to very impressive levels of critical thinking. I know people, especially, by the way, people in Korea, say that they're not raising creative kids, it's all rote memorization, and I think there's some truth to that. But when you look at what their kids are capable of doing, it's not just rote memorization. It's a very impressive level of critical thinking in math, reading, and science. But they're getting there through enormous pain and suffering. So 77% of Korean 15-year-olds attend some kind of after-school tutoring session. And by that, I don't mean what kids in Long Island do for the SAT. I mean, that is in the same universe, but not on the same planet. The market for education in South Korea is not unlike the market for sports in the United States. It is very sophisticated. It is very lucrative. It plays upon people's greatest hopes and fears. And if you think about sports and you think about education and you just switch countries, you will understand perfectly what is going on in South Korea. So this is a place where there's a lot of anxiety around test scores, around getting into a great university. There are lots of countries like this. South Korea is maybe the extreme version. In fact, there was a Singapore education minister who was asked by a reporter about all the kids going to tutoring sessions in Singapore, and wasn't he worried? And he said, well, at least we're not South Korea. So this is kind of the extreme case for various reasons. And so that's the pressure cooker model, right? Where kids are not just they're going to school all day for a fairly long school day, and then they're going, most of them, to some kind of private after-school academy, which literally mirrors everything they just did in school, after school. So all the subjects, again, which is, I think we can all agree, a pretty inefficient and also inequitable way to get to the top of the world, because the best teachers in Korea charge the most money in this after-school market, which leads to the incredible phenomenon of there being millionaire teachers in South Korea, which, while very cool, even they will criticize this system that nobody seems to be able to disrupt once that anxiety machine gets going. So you have the pressure cooker, you have utopia. I found, luckily for me, very quickly, American students who agreed to be my sort of fixers on the ground, who were going to these places. Kim was going from Sallisaw, Oklahoma, to Finland. Now, you may ask, why Finland? I mean, I don't know about you, but if I had the chance to go somewhere when I was 15, Finland would not have been on the list, even it's number 75 or 80. Like, it wouldn't have even cleared the list. So Kim is this remarkable young woman who had never left the United States, actually. She was born in Oklahoma. Her mother, she had a single mother who also had never left the United States, was a teacher, actually. And yet, Kim always felt this kind of craving to see the world, this curiosity about what else there was beyond Oklahoma. And so she would complain, as teenagers occasionally do. She would complain about her town and the small town, and the only thing there was a Walmart and this and that. And finally, her half-sister, who lived in Texas, said to her once, well, why don't you just, she called her bluff. She said, why don't you just go live in some other country if you think it's so great? And she said, what do you mean? And she said, like on one of those exchange programs where kids go to another country. And she said, well, that's for rich kids. That's not for me. But that night, the seed was planted, and Kim began Googling, which is how all great and terrible ideas begin. And she started Googling exchange programs, and she found that there are these organizations that will literally help you go live in another country for a year. So this captured her imagination, and she started researching other countries, and she found many of them to be very interesting. And when she read about Finland, she read they had the smartest kids in the world, and she said, that's where I want to go. So she told her mom the next day, I'm going to go spend a year in Finland. And her mom, this is her last child at home, and again, Kim had never left the country. And of course, her mom's first overriding instinct was to say, the hell you are. But instead, very cagily, because she knew Kim was stubborn and she was a teenager, and sometimes you have to be clever, she said, okay, well, how much does it cost? And Kim looked it up and said it cost $10,000. And she said, well, if you can raise the $10,000 yourself and do all the paperwork and do everything you need to do by yourself, then you can go. So Kim spent her freshman year of high school in Oklahoma raising $10,000. Nobody, including Kim, thought that she would succeed for at least half of the year. She started with a bake sale at her local supermarket. She stayed up all night making Rice Krispie treats and chocolate chip cookies, and quickly discovered that for all of its charms, bake sales are not actually a highly profitable way to raise money, and that she would need to have something like 1,000 of them before she was able to go to Finland. So then she tried other things. She ordered a case of beef jerky off the internet and sold beef jerky door to door, which actually turned out to be very lucrative, just as a side note. So she did really well with that. And then she wrote a letter to all 60 businesses listed in the Salisal Chamber of Commerce, asking them for money, for sponsorship, to support this crazy American girl with a dream. Very sweet. She created this letterhead and everything. No one responded. No one. Now remember, this was at the tail end of the recession. The businesses in Salisal had other things to worry about. But what I love about this story, and which is why I'm kind of dwelling in it almost unreasonably, is that she didn't give up. She didn't give up. She created a blog and she asked strangers for money, and bizarrely, some of them gave her money. She applied for scholarships, which she got. But what I like about the story is that it's a story about a particular kind of American girl, an American young person who doesn't quit, who's entrepreneurial, who has a dream, who's curious. So as much as we are critical of our education system, it's important to hold in our head at the same time all of the strengths that we have, which are embodied in kids like Kim all over the country. So Kim raises $10,000, and because God has a sense of humor, she is placed in rural Finland, on the west coast of Finland, in a town called Pietarsaari, and actually placed with another single mother, the mother of two 5-year-old twin girls. So off she goes to the utopia. And what will she find is the question. She has all kinds of ideas, of course, about what Finland will be like and what it won't be like and how it will be different from her school in Salisal, which she didn't really like, and she struggled to fit in and all these things. Before we get to what she found, I want to tell you about the other student who went to the other extreme, to the pressure cooker country. Now, interestingly, this kid, Eric, in some ways grew up in a different country than Kim, for all intents and purposes. This kid was from Minnesota. He had the good fortune to attend one of the highest performing, tricked out, most beautiful suburban high schools in the state. He had an intact family. He had lots of advantages. He did theater. He did the International Baccalaureate program. He did all kinds of things. He had some great teachers that to this day he tears up talking about. He's kind of dramatic, Eric. As senior year approached, he was realizing he was kind of burnt out, and he just wanted to change. He just kind of wanted a break, like a break from all the academic intensity of Minnesota. So this is where he makes his one big mistake, which is he decides to take an academic break in South Korea, which is literally, I cannot think of a worse place to take an academic break. So he makes this decision, we all make decisions for reasons that in retrospect look questionable. He went to an exchange student fair, and there were booths with kids from different countries, and the Korean kids were so fun. They were super joyful. And it is actually true, while I'm making sweeping stereotypes, the Korean kids are super joyful. Like, I have never met a group of kids who are more exuberant. And in fact, when he first arrived at his high school in Busan, South Korea, big booming city on the coast of South Korea, and he walked in, the kids started screaming the way kids screamed for the Beatles, like a sort of high-pitched, oh my God, something's terribly wrong kind of sound, until he realized that was for him. So in some ways he was right. In other ways he was very, very wrong. So he ends up in South Korea. So what did they find? I mean, I think there are lots of things, obviously, but some of the things that they found that I want to tell you about, since we have limited time, I'm going to talk about things that surprised me and may surprise you. And then we're going to open it up for questions. But some of the things that they found were obvious on the very first day, which I didn't expect, because they were aesthetic. So when they got to their schools in these countries, and there was a third student, I don't want to leave him out, I'll talk more about him, but he went from Pennsylvania to Poland. But all three of them, when they went to these countries, in their first days of school, they found the schools themselves to be rather lackluster, to look at. And anecdotally, when you go around the world to these countries, that is generally true. Not only are the schools not super impressive aesthetically, but inside there's not a lot of technology compared to many American schools. Actually, on average, American secondary schools, high schools, have a 1-to-1 ratio of students to computers at this point. And that is way above the average for the developed world. So, Finland and South Korea have more like 1 computer for every 2 students. So you didn't see a lot of the digital whiteboards that you see in classrooms in America. You didn't see a lot of that. You certainly didn't see a lot of green, lush fields for playing sports. Tom's school in Poland didn't even have a cafeteria. There was sort of a sad vending area that kids used. But that was one thing that was fairly obvious to the kids right away. Another thing that they didn't see in these schools were parents. They almost never saw parents anywhere. And it's true, if you go to a school, even an elementary school in Finland, you don't see a lot of parents hanging around, selling things, handing things out, signing things, whatever it is that you see in many American schools, you don't see that. And it turns out, actually, that there have been studies of this, of different parenting styles in different countries, and they're not perfect. I wish they were better. But one thing we know is that all around the world, the more time that parents spend on extracurricular activities in their kids' schools, so the kinds of things that are sort of classically American PTA activities, selling things, bake sales, chaperoning, coaching, those kinds of things, which are great community-building, fun things. The worse those parents' kids do on the Pisa Test by age 15, even after controlling for socioeconomic status, which is sort of surprising. As an American parent, I was like, what? I've been lied to all of these years. And then the more parents talk to their kids about their days, about movies, about the news, and read to them, of course, when they were little, the better kids did on the Pisa Test by age 15, even after controlling for socioeconomic status. So this was something that the teenagers, the American teenagers, noticed. They felt like they had a lot more autonomy in these countries. I ended up surveying hundreds of teenagers who had gone on exchange programs to see if there were patterns in what they found. And there were remarkable patterns. One thing that they said, 7 out of 10 international exchange students felt like they had less freedom in the US than back home. And 7 out of 10 also said they saw more technology in the US classrooms than back home. And I mention this not because I think technology is a bad thing, but because it comes up again and again when you look at the data and also talk to people, talk to kids and teachers. What you see is not so much that technology itself is the problem, but that there is a lack of focus in American schools on actual learning. So if you are very focused on learning, if it's a kind of urgent economic imperative, which it became in these countries, then you do things a little differently, right? So there is no evidence that the enormous investments we as a country have made in education technology have actually led to learning on average. Quite the opposite in many cases. I hope that will change. I have great hopes for what we are seeing in customized learning and blended learning and that kind of thing. However, there is maybe sometimes a tendency for us to be enchanted by shiny objects in this country. I think that's fair to say. And you see that in all parts of the country, but also in schools. And you see that school is about so many things here, right? And that's part of the beauty of it. But it's something that when exchange students come here, they notice right away. School is about track and yearbook and French club and definitely football. That's huge, right? And they're kind of amazed by this because in most countries, school is just about learning, which is much less fun. Let me be totally clear about that. However, if you think about any big, complex organization trying to do something hard, whether it's a hospital or a school, one of the #1 things they need is focus. And in this country, I didn't even know this, but I eventually found out that in this country, our high school principals spend sometimes half their days dealing with meetings about sports, athletic budgets, getting referees, getting people to line the fields, meeting with parents who are upset because their kid's been benched, meeting with a school board member who they've never met before, but since they're hiring a new football coach, they've heard from this person for the first time. These are all true stories, and if you talk to American high school principals, this is what you hear. This is how their days look. This doesn't happen in these countries. Just take half of your plate off, and you just focus on learning. So this is something that came up again and again. But probably the most important thing that the kids noticed, and which is in some ways is more profound, and took them longer to notice once they got, the hang of the language and other things. They noticed that school in these countries was harder. It was certainly harder in Korea, even for Eric, who'd gone to a very high-performing school. Sometimes harder bad, right? Like not harder good. One of the things Eric noticed, of course, was that kids were going to school night and day, and they had no time to socialize and explore the city with him because they were going to hagwons, after-school tutoring academies. And so this was incredibly depressing to Eric. He could see how much strain they were under, and it's true. If you talk to the Korean kids I met, they, again, had lots of energy, very joyful culture, and then as soon as they started talking about school, all that drained from their faces. And they talked about how terrible the system was, how they were pitted against each other. I didn't realize I was going to actually make an alarm, but this is a new stopwatch I'm trying out. But anyway, it did get my attention and yours. I apologize. I'm trying not to go over my time so that we have time for Q&A. Anyway, so he noticed that they really loathed the amount of time they had to put in, the amount of pressure was on them. At the same time, he loved his Korean math class. This was something that really struck him. For the first time, he was learning trigonometry, geometry, and calculus all in one class. And by the way, he was with kids who were 2 years younger than he was. And he was astounded at how much more interesting it was. He had no idea those things connected. And that, in fact, they only make sense when they're connected. And so for him, this was a true breakthrough. In other cases, one of the things Kim noticed in Finland is that the kids had less homework than kids back home in the US. But the homework they had was much more demanding. It really required them to think for themselves. There was a girl that I interviewed who had come from Finland to go to a public school in Michigan on exchange for a year. And it was similar to her school in many ways in Finland. But one thing she noticed was that not, as she put it, not much was asked of American kids. She felt like she was doing a lot of posters, the kind of things she'd done in elementary school in Finland, a lot of cutting and pasting. And it was a little frustrating, but luckily she had track and yearbook and things that she really did enjoy. But she tells the example of one journalism class she took where she loved the teacher, and everyone seemed to really be learning from this teacher and to respect her. And the end of semester project in this class was to write 10 articles, which made sense. And then when that day came, Elena, the Finnish girl, was the only one who did all 10 articles. And she was amazed by this, and the teacher was, disappointed, but life went on. And so somewhere along the way, different messages had been communicated to Elena than to her American peers about not only what they needed to do, but what they could do. So this is a big issue and something that came out in the surveys as well. 9 out of 10 international exchange students said their classes in the US were easier. So if you get a group of exchange students together from all over the world who are living in the US, they will disagree about many things, they have very, very different impressions, but one thing they will almost certainly agree on is that school in the US is super easy. This is a complicated subject, but it is so pervasive, not only in what kids tell us. By the way, half of American high schoolers say that they are challenged in their academic classes, but in the data itself, where we know that even our most privileged kids are not doing math at the level of privileged kids in other countries. So we are systematically underestimating what our kids can do, sometimes out of the goodness of our hearts, which is, to me, the most poignant part. And then I want to open it up to questions. But I just want to say that in this country, we have gone along pretty well by letting kids graduate from high school with a sort of nominal amount of contribution. And then, once they're 18, we let them find out what the world has in store for them. That no longer works, because they are finding out too late that the world has changed, and they need skills. They need to be able to think. They need a mental agility that they didn't need before, because all of them will not only have to audition for their jobs in ways that are much harder to fake, but they will have to re-audition over and over and over and over. And they will have to adapt and change very quickly, as many of us in this room have had to do as well. So there were lots of things they noticed. There's a lot here. But I think the overriding principle was that school was harder in ways that made them have to think, and that this is possible, which is best represented by the country I didn't get to, but it's in the book, which is Poland, a country that has a 16% child poverty rate, but has gone from below average for the developed world on the Pisa Test to above in 2012. There are now a greater percentage of Polish 15-year-olds scoring at an advanced level in math than there are 15-year-olds in Finland, which is remarkable, because Poland, who's been to Poland? Poland, too, is a complicated place. Right? This is a big, sprawling country with a long history of trauma and dislocation and distrust for the central government. Thank you all for being so patient. It's been great to be here. And now let's open it up to questions. If you have any questions, thank you. Yes.
Two quick questions. How do you spell Pisa? I'd like to follow up on that.
Okay.
And secondly, did you find a gender difference in American students? I can only relate to my two ninth graders, both girls, never had a B in their life in a difficult school. One explaining the entanglement theory of physics to me in the 8th grade.
Wow. You know, interestingly, first of all, I'll take the easy question. PISA is spelled P-I-S-A, and you can read all about it. It's the OECD that puts it out. As far as gender, it's really interesting. In the developed world, there are differences here between developed and developing countries. In the developed world, what you see as a most consistent pattern is actually that girls are pulling ahead of boys, particularly in reading. There's still in some places some gender gaps in math and science, but just as an example, Finland has a worrisome gender gap between boys and girls on the Pisa test. So girls are doing significantly better than boys. This is something that they have whole conferences about, trying to figure out. Luckily for Finnish boys, the average boy is still doing way better than the average American. But that gap is still worrisome and something that, that I think should worry all of us as we start to see that gap growing in a different direction all over the developed world. Yes?
Hi. First, Amanda, as someone who spent 4 decades in education, thank you for your book. It really is insightful and changing. But here's my question, okay? Suppose on your walk to where you're going to your book signing, your phone rings and it's Barack Obama. And he says,
happens.
I know. And he says, Amanda, you know, I've read your book, it's changed my life. Give me your 3 suggestions for American school. They can be in priority or just, you know, what do you think we should do? What would you tell him?
Yeah, would that he could do any of them, but I will tell him. So one thing that I think we have underinvested our energy in is the selection and training of teachers. You know, we have some fantastic teachers all over this country, and the profession still is not treated like or acting like a real profession. One of the things that I always heard was, oh, teaching is hard, teaching is this, and I always said those things. I said teaching is hard. The more time I spend in classrooms, the more I start to viscerally understand that. It's not hard like, you know, working at a soup kitchen is hard. It's hard like being a surgeon is hard. Like being a judge is hard. It requires, in the moment, complicated, dynamic changing and thinking that is extremely, extremely difficult to master. So we have right now 1,400 education colleges of wildly varying quality and selectivity scattered across the country. We educate twice as many teachers as we need, particularly in elementary school. And we don't confer any real serious, rigorous training and expectations among many of those students until they're in the classroom. And then suddenly we're all, why can't you get it done? You know, and we're not supporting them or treating it like a real master profession in most places until very late, and ever, actually. We're never doing that. Now, that's something that other countries have been through. We are not the only ones, and that should be reassuring. And I talk in the book about how Finland shut down its education colleges and reopened them in the most elite universities. And today, getting into ed school in Finland is like getting into MIT in the United States, which is important not only because you have highly educated teachers, which is nice, but not everything. Part of it is it sends a signal to everyone else in the country that you're not just saying, if you're Barack Obama, that education's important and teaching is hard, but you're acting like it. So I'm going to tell you what, if he could just do that, that would make me happy. That alone, focusing on education colleges at the beginning of a very challenging career that needs to have a year of hands-on student teaching, that would be a much more elegant reform than a lot of the things we have tried to do. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My favorite question is, how did we put a man on the moon without standardized tests? And I would answer, we did it with everything we've eliminated, the music that translates into higher order learning skills. So my questions are, one, in the education databases, before standardized tests took over and hundreds of millions of dollars were diverted from the classroom budget to pay for the tests to companies that had nothing to do with education, the ERIC databases documented the gifted and talented curricula as by far the most effective. And if every classroom could have become a gifted and talented classroom with the high expectations, low student-teacher ratio, that we would have what we really should be looking for. And then the second portion of my question...
And we are almost out of time, so
okay,
let me just answer that.
Let me just ask one.
Let me just answer that. Well, you've asked a really good question, so I don't want to run out of time to answer this question. So, you know, if you look back at the international data, to the degree there is data, what you see is that there was never a time when American kids were on top of the world when it comes to these higher order skills, even before we had the extreme level of standardized testing that we have now. It is true that we do a lot of testing and that most of those tests are not very smart. So what you see running through this conversation, right, is quantity over quality. Part of that is because of federalism, honestly. The only thing that Barack Obama can do is to keep demanding results, and he can't really do much to help kids and students and teachers get there. So they keep pushing, the feds keep pushing the testing lever, and now we see where it's gotten us, because you have, this kind of crazy quilt of testing. If there is something positive to say, then it is that the 40-some states that have adopted the Common Core state standards are doing something that all of the world's education superpowers have done. It is very, very hard to inject rigor into a system. One way to do it is to set clear, rigorous, more coherent targets for what kids should know at every grade level than what you had before. That kind of coherence and consistency and clarity is really lacking from the US system, partly because of federalism. So you're seeing huge fights over those standards, right? And some of those fights need to happen. Some of them do not and would not happen in another country. Those documents are living documents. In Finland, Korea, Poland, all these countries have standards. Finland has it for every subject, not just math and reading, but for home ec and phys ed and history. And this is the thing that I think is right within our grasp. If we could continue down this path, keep tweaking the standards, that's fine. The assessments are a whole nother thing that's going to go down the spring. But having clear, rigorous, consistent standards is probably the smartest reform we've made in 20 years. Thank you so much for having me here. It's great to have this audience here.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.